Now, before we add any kind of sign-in button to our application, let's take a moment to understand what's going on underneath the hood when the user signs in. And that means it's time for dun-da-da-da, our introduction to OAuth 2.0. Now, if you feel like you're already an expert in this stuff, you know it like the back of your hand, feel free to skip the rest of this video. But you must be some kind of crazy genius, because frankly, I think this whole topic is kind of complicated. You could write a whole book on it. Come to think of it, this guy did. And you should read it if you want a more thorough understanding of OAuth 2.0. And that does mean, for the purposes of fitting this entire topic into a 10 to 15 minute YouTube video, I'm going to be oversimplifying this thing in places. In fact, probably to the point where some bits maybe aren't entirely accurate. Also, I should probably make this clear, I'm no expert here. I just happen to be able to talk to people who really are experts, and then hopefully I can pass that information on to you. But that said, this should be enough for you to have a general understanding of what's going on underneath the hood. While all the nitty-gritty details of OAuth 2.0 are going to be hidden from you by the libraries we provide, I always think it's just kind of good practice to have a general understanding of what some library is doing for you behind the scenes when you're calling any of these, mysterious functions. But if you do notice anything that just seems outright wrong, please let me know in the comments. I do read them. I might even respond. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into our presentation. So the analogy I frequently hear with OAuth 2.0, and it's one that I really like, is that it's kind of like dealing with a system of valet keys. If I have a valet key for a car, it probably lets the valet, say, unlock the doors and start the engine, but maybe it doesn't let them open the trunk, so you can still keep your valuables or your bodies or what have you in there. If you happen to have a very fancy car, which I do not, these valet keys might also prevent you from, say, driving over a certain speed or taking it off any sweet jumps. I mean, think about how different Ferris Bueller's Day Off might have been if Cameron had just had a valet key that he could have given to the parking attendants, right? Totally different movie. Incidentally, in the world of OAuth 2.0, these valet keys also have the special ability to self-destruct in a certain amount of time. So this valet better park my car in the next 60 minutes or he's not going to be able to do anything with it. The bright side is that if my valet happens to lose the key in the parking lot somewhere, there's only a limited window in which someone could find it and steal my car with it. By the way, these keys are generally referred to as access tokens. They're also sometimes called bearer tokens, meaning that all of the powers of this key are granted to the owner or bearer of the key. Technically speaking, I guess not all bearer tokens are access tokens, but in the world of OAuth 2.0, they usually are. So for the purposes of our oversimplified tutorial, I'm going to use these two phrases interchangeably throughout these lessons. So what do these keys look like in an application context? Well, you might have a valet key that lets an application, say, view the contents of a Google Drive folder, but maybe not delete files there. In the case of Play Games, our valet key gives an application access to achievements, leaderboards, and lets them view some basic user info. But it wouldn't, for instance, let that application view the user's Google Drive folder, or say send Gmail on their behalf, or use any other Google services. By the way, these specific abilities that these valet keys have are referred to as scopes, and you'll hear that term used throughout the rest of this video. So what does it look like if you're trying to sign into an application using one of these valet keys? Well, maybe you can think of it a little something like this. Let's say I want to get into a club, but the bouncer won't let me in until he sees some ID. Well, I might say to the bouncer, "Tell you what, Mr. Bouncer, I'm going to give you this special valet key. This key will let you open the doors and the glove compartment of my car. It won't let you drive my car, it won't let you open the trunk, but you can get into the glove compartment, and there you can find, say, my registration, which will tell you my name and my date of birth, and maybe then you'll let me in." So let's look at this again in a non-nightclub setting. Let's say I've got my fantastic new Angry Fruit game that I've just added a sign-in button to. When the user clicks that sign-in button, my application is going to say, "Hi Google, this is Angry Fruit the game. Please give me a valet key or an access key that lets me see basic user info, submit high scores, and set achievement progress." The first thing Google will do is present a dialog box to the user saying, "Hey user, this is the information that this Angry Fruit app is asking for. Are you cool with this?" Let's assume the user says yes. At this point, Google will then give our application a valet key and say, "Here you go, have fun." At this point, by the way, our application still doesn't know who this user is. We just have a valet key that we know belongs to this user. But what we can then do is ping Google services and say, "Hi, I have this user's valet key. Can you please send me the user ID that's associated with it?" The first thing Google will do is verify that the valet key is valid, that it has the proper scope that allows my application to see the user's ID, and that it hasn't expired. Assuming that's all cool, it'll say, "Sure thing, here's the user's ID number." And at that point, I have an ID number from an authoritative service that I trust, in this case Google, and I can proceed without ever having to ask my user to set up yet another username and password that I need to hire a security team to watch over. So let's take a look at this request again, maybe a little closer to the code. Here's our request. "Hi Google, this is Angry Fruit. Please give me a key with these scopes," and you'll notice I've added another bit of information, which is, when you're all done, please send this info to this URL that I'm providing to you. Now, what does this call actually look like? Well, this part here, "Hi Google," or perhaps more accurately, "Hi Google OAuth 2.0 servers," is equivalent to redirecting the user to a URL that points here, to accounts.google.com. Now, this part where we say, "This is Angry Fruit," is equivalent to adding a client ID to this request. This is a unique ID that identifies our application. "I want a key that lets me get basic user info, set leaderboards and achievements," is equivalent to adding this particular scope to our request. You'll notice that our scope looks like a URL, right? It looks like a web page I could access. There's actually nothing special about scopes that requires it takes the form of a URL. In fact, if you've done any work on Facebook, I believe their scopes look like just plain old text strings that say things like email or user_info. I think Google decided to make their scopes look more like URLs, partly because it makes it easier to break things up hierarchically. Different products can have different directories. And I suppose at some point in the future, we could set up a web page for each of these scopes that, say, gives you additional information about them. But again, there's no rule that says these have to look like URLs. It's just something we chose to do. Anyway, the final part of this request, which is to send the info back to a particular page, is equivalent to adding a redirect URI to the end of our request. So this big URL here at the bottom, this is actually the URL that we would send this user to. And it looks a little something like this. It's the OAuth 2.0 dialog. Now, assuming at this point the user clicks accept, this page would take a look at this redirect URI, and it would redirect the user back to a page beginning with that URI. But then we'd also need to send across the access token, and so we can send that along as a get parameter. This URI, by the way, will correspond, or hopefully should correspond, to a page that I've created on my Angry Fruit website. It can grab this access token information either through JavaScript or maybe as a dynamic server page, and then I can start making calls to Google services using this access token. And we're all done, right? Wrong. Turns out I just lied to you. And why did I do that? Why did I break this bond of trust we've been forming over the last 7 minutes? Well, because I want to demonstrate a security issue to you. Now, imagine that this is my redirect URI. It's redirecting to a page that's not using SSL, and our user is signing in from, Joe's Internet Cafe and Laundromat on some open and wireless access point somewhere. But it also turns out that inside Joe's Internet Cafe is our hacker man. I don't know why he's wearing a ski mask and gloves. It seems like that might make him kind of conspicuous, but I guess that's how he rolls. Now, this redirect itself is still being sent securely. All communication with Google is being done over SSL. But since our user's browser needs to access example.com, it might do that over a plain old insecure connection. And our conspicuously dressed hacker man, along with, say, anybody else that decides to view our server's web logs, will see this access token right there in the open. And suddenly, they can start masquerading as our player because they now have a bearer token belonging to that user, and they can wreak all sorts of havoc. So there are a couple of alternative methods that we can look at instead. The first way, and probably the most common, is to send a single-use code instead of an access token. Now, this code can be sent down to our server at example.com, and then our server makes a separate call to Google to exchange this code for a real access token. And it does this by sending along the code along with a client ID and a client secret that exists only on our server. Now, assuming all this information checks out, Google servers can then send back an access token to our servers at example.com. Our server can then make its own request to the Google Play service, like getting the user's ID, and then it can send that information back to the client, which also gives us a nice little benefit of not needing to keep the access token, which is a sensitive bit of information, over on the client. It's just one less place where our access token needs to live. But more importantly, Even if our hacker dude is able to intercept the code, he can't do anything with it because A, he doesn't have our client secret. Remember, that exists only on our server. And B, these codes are only valid once. After they're redeemed, they can't be used again. So he's pretty much out of luck. Sorry, Mr. Hacker. But Todd, you're saying, what if I'm a JavaScript engineer? I don't want to spend a lot of time doing server-side code. Can I just do this whole exchange a code for an access token thing directly on the client? Well, the answer is no. And it's because, remember, in order to exchange a code for an access token, we need to pass along that client secret. And that client secret is supposed to remain, well, secret. And if you were to keep a copy of it stored as a JavaScript variable somewhere, just about anybody with a copy of Chrome Developer Tools could dig it out. Luckily, it turns out there's another way to send off access tokens to a client if you don't want to do a lot of server-side logic, and that's sending it as a URL fragment. See how our question mark has been replaced with a little hashtag? You're probably used to seeing these to, jump to a particular section of a web page. But it turns out they're also useful in situations like this. You see, URL fragments don't get sent across in web requests. So when our user's browser goes out to example.com, the request doesn't include any type of access token information. But in the page that we get back, we can run some JavaScript that analyzes the full URL, including that fragment, and can extract the access token information from there. Again, leaving our conspicuously dressed hacker man out in the cold. That said, if you are going to be using this approach, you should do this using HTTPS. Otherwise, a very sophisticated hacker, probably one not wearing a ski mask, might be able to do something malicious like serve up your page with some modified JavaScript that could read the access token and do bad things with it or send it somewhere. And that's probably not a good thing. So in a situation like this, you should always use SSL. In fact, use it wherever you can. It's just a good idea. As long as we're talking about security, by the way, let's bring up one other situation. Let's say that my game is incredibly successful and my competitors over at Scammy Games are so jealous that they want to sabotage my game. And so they create their own game and have their own sign-in button, and their sign-in button creates a URL that looks a little something like this. This looks like a pretty normal OAuth dialog request, except that you'll notice that it's using Angry Fruit's client ID, but asking the redirect URI to go to Scammy Games. Now, if Google were to blindly trust that information, it would bring up an OAuth 2 dialog box, the user would probably click accept, and then it would send that information on to scammygames.com. And if we're using our send the access token as a URL fragment approach, Scammy Games would be able to grab the user's access token. At that point, it could trick my Angry Fruit game into pretending they were my unsuspecting player and wreak all sorts of havoc with their game because it now has a valid Angry Fruit bearer token belonging to our poor unsuspecting player. And we don't want that to happen. So instead what we do is Google keeps a database of all client IDs along with all redirect URIs that are allowed to be associated with this client ID. So in this case, my Angry Fruit game has a client ID, and we've set up a redirect URI that points to example.com/OAuth2 callback. So now when Scammy Games makes this request, Google will notice that it's got a client ID that matches something in our database, but it will also notice that the redirect URI does not match, and it will deny this request. And Scammy Games will not be able to grab a valid Angry Fruit access token. So at this point, I know we've been talking a lot about web games, but I know that we're making an iOS game. So what does this look like in the mobile world? It's pretty similar, except that instead of a request that looks like this, we're going to be on a mobile device, and we're going to ask the redirect URI to point to com.example.af:/OAuth2 callback. Now you'll notice this no longer looks like a web page, but this is still a valid address that is pointing to my Angry Fruit game on the iPhone. And that's because this com.example.af is associated with my bundle identifier in my application, and I'll be registering with the system that if you open up a URI that starts with com.example.af instead of, say, HTTP or mail to or FTP, that should go to my application. Google is still going to keep a database of client IDs and authorized redirects, and this authorized redirect is going to begin with a bundle identifier instead of looking like a web address beginning with HTTP. The other difference, and one that might surprise you, is that you might expect that since we're on a client-only application, we'd be doing the pass the access token as a URL fragment trick. And indeed, in many situations on mobile devices, this is what happens. But in our case, we don't do that. We're actually going to pass in a single-use code. But wait, you're saying, we don't want to pass a single-use code, right? Because in order to exchange that, we need to pass along our client secret. And you told us that it's a really bad idea to store a client secret on a client device. What's up with that? Well, it turns out that when we exchange a code for a token using a client ID that we know is associated with a mobile device, we actually don't need to use the client secret. This might seem like we're losing a little bit of security, right? Since anybody that intercepts our code might be able to use it. But you have to remember that now we're redirecting to another local application on the device instead of, say, another web page out there in the world. And that's considerably more secure. So this all generally works out in our favor. And we're able to get an access token back from our servers. So now that we hopefully understand a little more about the OAuth 2.0 process, and this tutorial hasn't confused you more than it's helped, let's get started by creating our very own client ID. And we'll be doing that in the next lesson.